Welcome. Good evening. I am Danielle Porter, Director of Preservation Services at Historic Richmond. Historic Richmond's mission is to shape the future by protecting and promoting the historic buildings and places that make Richmond unique, beautiful, and authentic. I'm excited to be here with you tonight by Zoom, although I am very much looking forward to a time when we can resume our in-person programs. You're probably all experts on Zoom by now. You can send questions in the Q&A feature. We probably won't necessarily respond if you do the chat feature. And we'll leave time to answer those at the end. Any questions we're unable to discuss, we'll answer in our Instagram stories next week. So follow us at Historic RVA. And you can learn more about our upcoming events or watch our past events on our website, historicrichmond.com, or on our social media accounts. All this is made possible by the support of our wonderful sponsors, Dominion Energy and TCV Trust and Wealth Management, and our partners at Quinn Evans Architects. Tonight's discussion is about preservation and sustainability. So maybe you joined us because you're wondering how these two goals can coexist. Or maybe you joined us because you already realize that they go hand in hand but want to know more. This topic is near and dear to me. Well, you can naturally assume that as a preservationist, I care deeply about historic buildings, but I care just as deeply about the environment and how we can help leave our natural world a better place than it is now. Here at Historic Richmond, we have been thinking a lot about sustainability and what it means, environmentally, socially, and economically, and how we can help encourage sustainability in our community. I come from a long line of scientists, and I'm proud to say that in the 1960s, while serving on the Livingston Conservation Council, my grandfather helped start the first recycling center in his town in New Jersey. But far more significant than just recycling glass, paper, and plastic is the concept of recycling and reusing our buildings. Preservation is inherently sustainable. Building reuse almost always offers environmental savings over demolition and new construction of a building of the equivalent size and function. The environmental savings from building reuse are quantifiable and significant. Demolishing and rebuilding takes a vast amount of energy and materials, both of which are increasingly in short supply. In the United States, approximately 40% of carbon emissions and total energy use is attributed to the construction and operation of buildings. This does not take into account the consideration of greenhouse gas emissions associated with manufacturing building materials and products. If those greenhouse gas emissions were included, the total share would be significantly higher than 40%. One study in California predicted that if the state continued at their current rate of demolishing and rebuilding for 25 years, they would have rebuilt 1/3 of their entire buildings and used enough energy to have powered the entire state for 10 years. Also, as we always like to remind you, rehab creates more jobs than new construction. The sustainability movement must prioritize preservation. If we were to demolish and replace every historic building with a new energy efficient building, it would still take between 10 and 80 years to overcome the new building efficient operations, the climate change impact from its construction. There are several different certifications used in the building world to signify sustainability, and we'll hear more about those later. These certifications could do a better job of factoring in the reuse of building materials and their longevity. After all, the largest carbon impact is constructing the building. Similarly, the preservation movement must prioritize sustainability. Climate change is having a real impact on our historic cities. Sea levels are rising, hurricanes are more frequent, rain events are more significant, and summers are hotter, just to name a few. Preservationists need to be more flexible in approaching sustainability issues. We want to make sure that buildings are reused to maintain our unique sense of place, but not at the expense of providing a place where people can live comfortably and happily. We acknowledge that preservationists and preservation standards could do a better job of removing barriers to building reuse. For example, being more accommodating to energy, to solar energy, accepting of alternative materials like treated woods that are more durable or insect-proof, or flexible in approaches to addressing energy efficiency. So thank you for joining us tonight for Preservation and Sustainability as we explore the relationship between sustainability and preservation. We'll discuss the impact of demolition on the environment, what sustainability means, and how you can effectively preserve historic buildings while also meeting goals for carbon reduction and energy efficiency using the recent renovation of Ryland Hall at the University of Richmond as a model. So now let me introduce tonight's panel. Julia Siple is a Senior Associate and Director of Sustainability at Quinn Evans. She's based out of DC, but supports sustainability initiatives, collaboration, and data-driven design across Quinn Evans. She formerly served as a Senior Manager of the AIA's Sustainable Knowledge and Practice area, where she directed the AIA 2030 Commitment Program, which encouraged architects to track and improve energy performance. Julia is a graduate of Rice University, which shares the same architect as the University of Richmond, Ralph Adams Cram. Rob Andrejewski is the Director of Sustainability and Adjunct Professor in the School of Professional and Continuing Studies at the University of Richmond. Rob draws his experience as a writer, facilitator, and educator to help the university stakeholders create solutions to issues ranging from climate change to zero waste. Rob has a PhD in recreation, park, and tourism management from Penn State University and is a senior fellow with the Environmental Leadership Program and is a Sustainable Excellence Associate. Rob lives in Richmond with his wife, Jenny, their 2 sons, and their Corona puppy, Blue. Charles Tilley is an architect and principal at Quinn Evans and is a leader of the firm's Learning Practice Group. Charles is a recognized design leader specializing in the creation of buildings that advance educational goals and support student life. His work highlights a sensitivity to place, craft, and people, leveraging spatial and functional exploration. Many of his projects have been focused on modernization and renovations to vision new purposes for existing spaces. With more than 25 years in planning and architectural design, his projects have achieved recognition with awards from A4LE, AIA, VSBA, and the National AIA Committee on Architecture for Education. I am going to, before we start with Julia, wanted to just do a quick poll with the audience. So I just launched it. You should all be able to see this. Do you consider preservation and sustainability to be compatible? And I'll give you a minute to respond to that. All right, pretty much all of you say yes, so I'm glad to see that. We'll have to talk with the one person who said no and is signed on here.
I hope we can change one mind tonight.
Yeah. Okay, so Julia, could you begin tonight's discussion by introducing us to the concepts of sustainability, climate change, and embodied carbon in buildings?
Great, thank you, Danielle. And again, thank you so much to Historic Richmond. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and have this conversation around preservation and sustainability. These are topics that we find really deeply embedded in our work, and really we believe strongly that they're very strongly and inherently connected. So as Danielle introduced, we're going to kind of hear 3 of us tonight, and it kind of goes into orders of detail here. Oops, let's see, am I advancing this? I am going to talk about the big picture. How does this connect preservation and sustainability? How are we starting to quantify and bring that to a few just very quick examples, because I think we need to be able to have better measurements to this value of preservation and sustainability. And then kind of getting into what does this mean in terms of the relevance and urgency of climate change. And I think there's a very important role of preservation. And so how can we make that very clear and more widely discussed? There we go. So just very briefly, a quick background on Quinn Evans and who we are. We're a full service architecture firm based in Richmond, DC, Baltimore, and Michigan. Really deep portfolio in preservation projects, cultural landscapes, and a lot of work with MPS. So getting into the conversation for tonight, just wanted to give kind of 3 points of context here. And I think these are really important things about where we are and where we're heading that is really framing why preservation and sustainability really really need to talk to each other all the time and urgently. So one is population is growing. We know that in the US, we're expected to gain another 100 million people over the next 40 years. We see that more people live in cities. So there's kind of a move towards more urban environments. I did see a stat that in Richmond, that equates to about 200 new residents every week. And then the planet is warming. So if we look at kind of these average global surface temperatures, that's rapidly increasing. So what are we going to do to address that and mitigate those impacts? So with that context of some changes, how do we make sure our built environment and how will that change it? And how do we make sure that we're really making the best places to live amidst that change? So with that, I guess, wanting to just think about what does it mean to create this human created landscape. I love kind of looking at this image here of the vista here of Richmond to think about what it really took in order to create what's there today. What is that going to look like over time? And how do we really adapt and make the best of that? And so I think that really gets at some of the heart of the issues of preservation and sustainability, meaning this long-lasting, very positive impact for the future that really acknowledges community and people. So recognizing that history, memories associated with place, equity, accessibility, health, that the aspects of people and community and history are really important. And then there's this component of resources. So how do we make sure we're thinking about all of the effort it took to get that, what is there today, and how do we keep that running? So I think there's ways that we would like to better quantify and value and prepare as we think towards the future in that. So also we create this landscape and we talk about preserving our resources and preparing for our future and making sure we're not impacting the future generations to have those same resources. But sometimes that doesn't acknowledge just how influential these are in terms of places that we live. And so how do we make sure that first and foremost, we are creating kind of the best healthy communities for people that are adaptable to that change. We shape our buildings thereafter, they shape us. So in that context of thinking about what it takes to get our buildings there in the first place, and then how do we maintain and bring that forward to the future in a very positive way. Just wanted to share a very brief set of project images, and we're going to go a lot more in depth into Ryland. But I think for Quinn Evans and the way that we've been doing this very deep work of historic buildings, renewal, transformation, and valuing what is there. But I think one of the things that we're trying to get to in even greater depth and ways is how do we measure and value that? So I think in each of these quick project examples, and this is a project that has beautiful features but has been abandoned for 30 years. So how do we think about valuing and maintaining a lot of that history and a lot of that material, which is significant? And so how do we start to frame the significance of what is there as something that was an investment of materials, and that is a resource to be valued? So here's another example, just thinking about how do we adapt existing spaces to be energy efficient? How does that drive down energy use? How does energy relate to carbon? How does carbon relate to dollars? I think it's how we start to string these things actually together that makes them kind of more meaningful and relatable. And so then the last very quick example here, because I want to give us plenty of time to talk, is the Plaza building, which is a building that was originally an office building and then has mid-century modern office building, and then was transformed into a residential building. So again, how do we think about a very long life for our buildings, thinking about different stages of renewal, and thinking about the investment of carbon over time and how that relates not just to the energy in those buildings, but the material. And so I think this investment in material and the original place and how we value that as a resource is something that we'll kind of get into further here. But I think that's in embodied carbon, one of the things that we see as particularly important to demonstrating why preservation and existing reuse is one of the most important things if we are able to take climate action and really make an impact on carbon. So wanting to give a little context of how we're starting to think about this, and some other projects come up with ways that we can see and measure it, because that makes it a lot more possible to manage things if you're able to value them and make comparisons. So then for carbon, kind of getting back to what is invested in our buildings, how is carbon relatable? Carbon is primarily generated anytime there's combustion, so burning of fuel. So all of the energy to create our buildings, the material to get them in place took a lot of energy to produce and move those buildings there, and materials there, and then to keep them running. So energy use is an ongoing use of carbon. So this might be familiar to some, totally new to others. But when we talk about carbon and carbon in our buildings, what does that mean? What parts of the building have carbon? Carbon is basically something that describes what it took to create every aspect or to keep the building running. So we're talking about manufacturing and transporting materials, installing it and putting it on the construction site, keeping it running. So if you're running with gas, there's combustion at site. If you're getting it from your grid, that energy is created somewhere. So there's different types of carbon, and the building industry in particular talks about it in these two forms, embodied and operational, where embodied is kind of the material side of things, and operations is what do we do to keep it running? That's our energy. And Danielle talked about this a little bit at the beginning about how globally our buildings are kind of responsible for about 40% of global greenhouse gases. If we look at that pie, about 28% of that is actually operational energy and 11% is embodied. So again, materials versus operational, the energy to run it. That's a lot of energy and carbon related to creating materials. And what is particularly interesting is that we see a lot of policies and progress about reducing operational carbon, codes, greening the grid. There's many ways that we're making pretty significant strides to operational carbon reductions. And as that continues to happen, the proportion and the relevance of embodied carbon continues to go up. So I think it's super important that we continue to retrofit our buildings and make them energy efficient. But I think that how we quantify that value of embodied carbon and embodied carbon being avoided by reusing a building is increasingly important. So why do we care about carbon? How do we start to measure it? How does it feel relatable? All metrics are only as useful as they're understandable. So if you give me a number, it doesn't mean anything until you have something that it relates to. Carbon is very tightly associated with the temperature rise. So it is the metric that we are aiming at reducing in order to meet our climate goals. And if you look industry-wide at policy, at potential incentives, there are a number of goals, and this is also starting to appear at the state level or city level or university level, goals for carbon. And I think Rob will get into this a little bit, where you look at where are we trying to make reductions to avoid these changes over the years. So, oops. So it can still seem like some large abstract numbers if you're talking metric tons of carbon. But I think especially as we start to get to building scale and a building scale of value and reuse, we can find relatable metrics. So this is an EPA carbon equivalencies tool, and we can certainly share a link to this. It's easy to get to, but it helps frame energy or carbon and other metrics so that it feels like a number you're familiar with. So I think this is one way that we're trying to think about how we think about how this relates to our buildings and how we evaluate priorities and choices. And so lastly, and as we tee things off then to hand this over to Rob, just really emphasizing that when it comes to carbon and making and valuing this investment of our buildings new and old really have to play a role in carbon reduction. So to meet the Paris Agreement, and if we're gonna hold the global warming temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, it means that not only are we trying to make really big strides in our energy performance, which is still really important, but we need to also value the existing buildings and the carbon that's really associated with creating those in the first place. And so I think that's where better ways to measure and value that are things that we really hope to see in the tighter connection between sustainability and preservation. So with that, I will turn things over to Rob to talk about how sustainability at U of R. And I think you're still muted.
Sorry. Thanks so much, Julia. And Rob, you should have control of the screen. And if you could just discuss some of the university's sustainability goals and initiatives, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you. And I just want to say thank you for having us here. Really appreciate Historic Richmond for not just the opportunity to share a bit about the University of Richmond and what we're doing with Ryland Hall, but also helping the relationship between us and Quinn Evans. It's really fun to work on a project together. And I think the best way to get to know someone is to work side by side. So thank you for helping make that happen. I work at the University of Richmond. I'm the director of sustainability there. And I think a lot of folks are probably familiar but this could be an international Zoom, who knows, or an international webinar. So the University of Richmond is in the western part of Richmond, and have about 4,000 students. It's a beautiful campus. It was just rated by US News and World Report as the most beautiful campus in the US last year. And a lot of that has to do with our architecture and the grounds and the intentionality that went into that, and a dedication toward both innovation and preservation. And like every person and every organization. COVID has been a significant challenge, but one of the things that makes University of Richmond special is the small class sizes and the number of students. We have a vast majority of our undergraduate students live on campus. So it's not just a workplace, it's not just a beautiful place, it's a home to many people. And the fact that we have been able to adapt to the challenges of COVID and do on-site education has been really amazing recently. And the university has been through a great deal of interesting history. We were not always in the western side of Richmond. We began in 1840, and our original old Ryland Hall and the old Ryland College, Old Richmond College, excuse me, the Ryland building, was on Lombardy and Grace downtown. And that started in 1840, and we were there, and there was a fire in 1910. Frederick Boatwright was president then and looked to moving west. There were other motivations, but that fire really kicked it off. And President Boatwright had worked with Ralph Adams Cram to envision a new building in a new location. And so in 1914, the University of Richmond moved to its current location, and also Westhampton College for women was there. In 1920, they came together as the University of Richmond. And my job came into place about 90 years later, after we signed onto a climate commitment. And the University of Richmond for a long time has had environmental commitments and environmental policies that didn't always raise to the highest level of awareness, but we've had a deep and long-standing commitment. And I'm really proud of where we are at the University of Richmond. And I just want to share a little bit about sustainability and how we view it there. And again, people know us for excellence in education, and they know us for how beautiful it is. There's the community spirit, the traditions. I'm excited to share with you some of the sustainability differences that we're making both locally and globally. To think about our definition of sustainability, I think that both Danielle and Julia did a good job of talking about sustainability, but it's a word with 6 syllables that people hear all the time. So I think it's important to operationalize it and just share how we view it at the university. So really, it's about creating environmental, social, and economic conditions that foster the health and well-being of people and the natural world now and into the future. So to break that down a little bit, there's a concept in business called the triple bottom line. And this is the idea that when we make decisions, we can't just look at the finances to decide whether or not that's a good decision. It's critical that we make decisions that are good economically, but we also need to build in the impacts on people as well as those on the environment when we make our decisions. And really it relates to this concept of well-being writ large, well-being for people, well-being for society, well-being for the planet. And a lot of folks might consider health and well-being to be synonyms. I like to view them as this idea of your health being your baseline. And when you're unwell, you're below that baseline. So you want to get back to where you were. Whereas well-being is thriving. Well-being is your best self. And so we really need to think about anything that reduces our health to stop doing that and get back to healthy. But then as an institution of higher education, we can utilize our resources, not the least of which is the brain power of our students and faculty, to create new solutions to problems to really increase societal well-being. And sustainability is not just about hugging trees or saving whales, though trees and whales are great. It's about people. It's really about the systems that people create and that we live in and that we operate in, and ensure that they can go on as much as possible in perpetuity. And sustainability looks to the past and says, what have we done that got us here? And it looks to the future, as many generations into the future, to say, what will happen if we choose to make this decision now? And putting a sustainability lens on decisions doesn't always make sense to folks immediately. But the more conversations we have, the more the values of sustainability really align with who we've been for a long time at the University of Richmond. And ultimately, if we have actions that are causing harm, we need to face them, recognize them, and stop them. And then to go to the positive, we need to build in solutions to do things that help others. And so in the case of carbon, like Julie was talking about, we are using electricity that burns fossil fuels, that emit CO2 emissions, that is raising the temperatures and changing the atmosphere such that our planet's warming, and we're having what Danielle mentioned, these issues with the fires and the flooding and increased storms. And, you know, we've got climate refugees. Climate change is here now. It's for a long time, it was talked about it coming. Now it's here. So we have to recognize our contribution to that and look at the operations that we've got and how we can address that, but then really embed it into our students' understanding of how they live, how it might impact others, and how we can move on. So that's sort of a background on how we view sustainability at the university. And we view it in a very scalar way. Ultimately, we start with the individual, whether this is a visitor to our campus, a first-year student, a faculty member. We need to meet those people as individuals and try to get them to be able to do certain things. And so we have programs like the Be a Green Spider program. So these is actions you can take as an individual related to water, food, energy, transportation, and waste, so that you can learn about these things and learn a greener lifestyle, a way to do things a little bit differently. And I think the idea of greening is great, but it only goes so far. So we also have a green room program where students are invited to get their roommates to adopt certain behaviors and come together, because we need collegiality, no pun intended, at a university, in order to move things forward. And then beyond the individual, because far too often we are given you're worried about climate change, change a light bulb solution. It's important to change your light bulbs to LEDs if you can, but that's not going to really stop carbon emissions writ large. So we need to work together. And so we have a lot of programs that are student facing, that we have clubs, we have in the Office for Sustainability, the University of Richmond Sustainability Advocates. All of these students go to a training on sustainability. They get Green Room certified. They take all of the Be a Green Spider quizzes to prove that they've got the knowledge. And then they become a volunteer corps for things like our Rethink Waste basketball game, or they help out in the community garden, or our new eco corridor. And then there's the campus level. And this is a really significant level, because if we're asking students to change, if we're asking individuals to change, well, we need to do the same at the institutional level. And so in 2019, we wrote our sustainability plan, which built on nearly a decade of climate action planning. And so part of that was to accelerate our rate of carbon neutrality. In 2018, we began discussions for Spider Solar, which is a large-scale solar array in Spotsylvania County that will neutralize all of the purchased electricity that we have. By far, our largest percentage of carbon emissions comes from the electricity we utilize, most of that to heat and cool our buildings and to light our buildings. And so that just went online recently. We've got a goal to divert 75% of our waste from the landfill. And then we've got 93 different other strategies to achieve sustainability. And they're not just operational. I've just highlighted the operational ones, but they also have to do with education. They have to do with research. They have to do with administrative policy and fundraising, and really putting our intentionality to work at the university. And so Spider Solar is something we're really excited about. The announcement came out in 2018. It takes a while. It's 130 acres for these things to go online. It went online officially last month. And so at the end of this year, at the end of 2021, we will be 57% below where we were in terms of carbon emissions in 2009. So we are trending in the right direction, in no small part because of this. We also, as part of our old climate action plan, and we re-upped this in the sustainability plan, all of our new campus construction must meet a green building standard. And that green building standard is LEED Silver or better. And the or better for that has to do with flexibility to not just use the U.S. Green Building Council, which manages the LEED program, but also to look at other programs. And so when it comes to green building, it's all about constructing buildings, utilizing buildings in a way that reduces our environmental footprint, and whether that's energy usage, or the amount of carbon emissions related to heating and cooling, the amount of water that's used, the amount of recycled materials, waste that's produced, but also education. There's a ton of opportunities in our buildings to use them as teaching tools, not just inside the classrooms, but the buildings themselves. And so we have right now 15 different buildings that are LEED certified. In fact, we had the first LEED certified building in Central Virginia back in 2004. And so for a long time, we utilized the LEED system, which has 6 main categories based on the site, water usage, the energy and atmosphere, the carbon emissions, and the amount of electricity used, the materials that went into the building, as well as the materials that left the building during construction, the indoor environmental quality, and this has really changed over time with LEED. It's become more and more important. That building occupant comfort has become more and more important, and innovation. We've recently shifted to something called EarthCraft, which Ryland Hall is being certified with. And EarthCraft is a program based in the Southeast. There's a ton of overlap with LEED. All of the green building certifications have a great deal in common. What we really like about EarthCraft is that the humidity that is particular to the Southeastern United States is really baked into the program. So the building envelope, which is not something that we've looked at in other buildings, really has to be tightened up in order to be certified for an EarthCraft building. And what's really also wonderful is we work with a group called Viridian, and they're right here in Richmond. And so we get a lot of hands-on resources from them. EarthCraft is based, it was created by Southface, which is based in Atlanta. And they also are known as the first green building certification to have a historic preservation certification. It's the ECSP. And so what's really nice is that as these things evolve, green buildings, in 2004, when our head of facilities, Andrew McBride, was really pushing it was pushing a ball uphill. Now the standard building practices would have been LEED certified back when it all started. It's really amazing how the industry has shifted from people who said, we can make a difference doing what we do a little bit better. And so it keeps innovating and the standards keep growing, but it's really great to see how much this has been adopted in the industry. Ryland Hall will be our 17th certified green building on campus, and it's going to be our second EarthCraft building. We're really excited about the idea of a green building, which when folks think about sustainability and they think green, especially the operational part, they're often thinking about things like solar panels and windmills and electric vehicles, and it's all about shiny and fancy. And historic buildings are often about being anchor institutions, and there's more gravitas there. And I think Ryland brings together the innovation of sustainability in the way it's viewed, but also the preservation of sustainability, because ultimately what we're trying to do is have things last in perpetuity. And we need to change how they're used and maybe change the inner workings, and that's really critical. Related to buildings, though, it's really challenging to tell the story. One of the tenets of sustainability is making the invisible visible. And with a building, folks assume that the lights happen because you flipped a switch. They don't really think about the electricity production. Water comes out because you turn the faucet. And so we really need folks to think about the tangibility of it. And so there's storytelling that needs to happen. When we do things like composting, it's entirely different because people hold on to a material and they can put it to responsible reuse. And we want people to think in the same way about how they use buildings. And so we have a new composting initiative on campus that gets toward our 75% waste diversion goal. And composting is a different way of getting rid of waste than most people are used to. The difference, though, between the landfill, where things sit in a hole in the ground and go to no reuse, is that compostable materials are ground up, essentially baked at a very low heat. They organically cook and they get sifted out, and then it becomes a soil nutrient. So your waste goes to responsible use, and that circularity is another core tenet of sustainability. It's really easy for people to understand that, and that's why I wanted to share the composting. And it's a lot harder for folks to see sustainability inside a building unless they see those shiny solar panels or windmills. But they don't have to be there for it to be a sustainable building or a sustainability project. The next level that I want to mention is that our atmosphere is global, and our boundary of our campus is really arbitrary when it comes to sustainability and resource issues. And so it's exciting that we are part of such a vibrant community in Richmond and the local counties. And so we're involved with a great number of organizations, and this is just a few of the groups that our students intern with or work with during the year. And we learn from them, and they learn with us, and we try to promote sustainability as partners as much as possible. And then, of course, we're in the US, and just now, I mean, it's happening so quickly, the change in federal administration and the recognition that climate change is an important thing again. It's, who knows what the next 4 years will bring. And it's a little bit like watching a tennis match with, shifting so quickly. But it's really important it was really important for us to recognize that when we dropped out of the Paris Climate Agreement 4 years ago, the University of Richmond joined with a ton of other organizations and cities and said, we still believe in the importance of addressing climate change. And we doubled down on our commitment in 2015, which really in a large part led the way to procuring our new solar array. And so we are now still we're back in officially as a pledge. We haven't signed back on yet as a nation into the Paris Climate Accords. And there's a ton of movement with climate change right now. I just think it's really important for us to recognize that the actions that we have locally do have national implications and also international and global, because when we think about climate, we need to really think about reaching carbon neutrality, meaning we won't emit any greenhouse gases at all, or if we do, we'll account for them by adding carbon sequestration or adding either renewable energy like power, like we're doing with our solar array, or planting trees and sequestering carbon. So we have one planet. We all have to figure out how to live on it together. There's many millions more of us each year on this planet sharing this space, and we have to change what we're doing in order to keep each other happy and healthy. So that's the approach to sustainability at the University of Richmond. My office is small, but our charge is large. And so these are some of the programs from establishing goals, doing a lot of bean counting about how we're doing with those goals, engaging people with events and programs. And then each year we choose a few initiatives, and it's a thrilling job. It's a big job. And I just feel really lucky that our university has committed so much to sustainability and to trying to make a difference and baking it into everything that we're doing.
Thank you, Rob.
My pleasure.
I am going to do another polling question before we move on to Charles. So I'm going to test your architectural knowledge. You can vote on what style you think the University of Richmond campus is built in. All right, I'm gonna give you like 10 more seconds if you haven't cast your vote yet. Okay, most people voted. So most of you got this correct. It's collegiate Gothic. And then we tricked you with some of our other ones, but no one fell for my Richmond vernacular, which I guess you could say there's a Richmond vernacular, but it was my made up. Almost did red brick West End. All right, well, on that note, I'm gonna pass it off to Charles, and there you go.
Thank you, Danielle. Good evening. I just wanted to share a little bit more about the history of Richmond College and University of Richmond. If you didn't know that Rob touched on this a little bit, but Richmond College was founded here in 1840, and this is Grace Street. You see it kind of terminated at some point. And Lombardy is on this side, and Ryland, I believe, is right here. So it was in the near West End back in the 1840s. Lost control here, Danielle. there we go. And so the campus was several blocks wide here, but you can see Gray Street coming in. This was original Ryland Hall, named after the first president, Robert Ryland, built on Gray Street there. And so somewhere around the early 1900s, around 1910 or so, the trustees bought this land that Rob was talking about in the West End, and enlisted the Boston architect Ralph Adams Cram to master plan the campus and plan the first few buildings of campus. And in this plan, you can see this is the original master plan. The lakes here on the south side is the Women's College, or West Hampton College, and then the men's side, which was Richmond College at the time. And those first four original buildings, Ryland's here on the right. It's the first academic building on campus here. And then Jeter and Thomas, which were residential dorms at the time. And then Sarah Brunet Hall, which was the refectory, or the dining hall. And as a part of the Ryland you see here on the right, this was the original sort of conceptual drawing that Cram did. This extension was intended to be a future library extension to the building, which never really materialized. But Ryland's here on the right. That's the conceptual image. So Cram was known most for his mastery of the collegiate Gothic style, which is a type of Gothic revival architecture that was popular on academic campuses and religious buildings in the late 1800s and 1900s. And Cram was active in other areas of Virginia, or Richmond as well. Over at the Caroline, he designed the Virginia War Memorial at the Caroline over at Byrd Park, as well as the master plan and some buildings over on Sweetbriar's campus, about the same time as U of R. He's also well known for the Rice University master plan, or the early campus buildings, West Point, as well as St. Thomas Church in New York City. Ryland Hall was built in 1914 and named for the first president. His brother was the first librarian, so the building has like two sides. The original library side here is named for Charles Ryland, and the other academic side named for Robert Ryland. These early images show how the campus pathways sort of were formed, and they're still kind of active in that same orientation today. Ryland was a multi-purpose building with a variety of administration and classroom, office space, as well as the library. Campus library was on the second floor of the building section on the right over here. And you can see in this original view, the architect left a space for a building to continue there, as you saw in that original sketch, which ultimately never materialized. So over 100 years, the building has had several renovations, various mostly interior upfits or changes of things over time. And the main one was in 1955, when the library was moved out of the second floor of the wing on the right-hand side here, and moved into the new Boatwright Library, which was south of this building. And in 2019, the university created a project that had several key goals, really. Replacing the building systems and improving the indoor environmental quality of this building was really one of the major driving forces behind this. Providing accessibility throughout the building was another one. There was no elevator in this building, and so figuring out how to vertically circulate through the building in an elevator was an important part. And improving student and faculty workspaces, as well as providing gathering areas, that spaces for students and faculty to meet after and before classes. And then preserving and restoring the exterior portions of the building that had really been weathered over time, the masonry, the roofing, and components such as that. The building is used for classrooms, the English and history offices, and this project expands this building to include a new humanities commons that will relocate classics and philosophy departments into this facility. Just a few pictures of the existing building. This is the loggia on the left that faces up, that faces out onto the stern quad, and then a typical classroom, which by and large we're refreshing these spaces for the most part. Most of them stay sort of in the same orientation. A couple more pictures, the general quality of spaces on the inside that were there when we started renovation. And as Rob noted, the university also has several sustainability goals, as they do with all their projects, and we're pursuing EarthCraft Light Commercial for this project. And there's several key areas of the EarthCraft program that we are working into this project. And I'll just point out a couple of them. The durability and moisture management, which is really looking at the exterior envelope and improving all of those areas, roofing, flashing, trying to keep water and moisture out of the building. And a building 100 years old can have a few issues like that. And also indoor air quality. One of the biggest components of this project is full mechanical renovation of the entire building, and replacing all of those systems and providing fresh air into the spaces. You can see the typical mechanical unit that is sitting on the floor in most of the rooms. These were not ducted units, so they didn't have fresh air. They were really just recycling it. So we're providing fresh air to all the spaces now. And then also improving all of the lighting, even beyond some of the upgrades that were done several years back. This system would be 40% more efficient than what the current code requirements are. Again, talking about durability and moisture management, waterproofing the basement, the lower half of the first floor here. There's a partial basement around the building. And so keeping water out was important, and repairing a lot of the damaged surfaces with the cast stone, which was, you know, 100-year-old cast stone has several issues, and repairing in place and touching up the masonry around the building. And then you can see the windows, a lot of the windows are being replaced with new thermally efficient windows. There are several places where we're carefully doing that with the stone tracery, but one of the best parts about this building is the windows, and you can really see with EarthCraft the amount of light that the exterior windows bring into the spaces. And that's one of the points that we're getting as you look at the EarthCraft list. In the campus plan here, Ryland's here in the center, and all of the orange highlights are campus student paths. And you can see one of the major issues that we dealt with was bringing people into the building because most of the entrances are on the west side, really trying to connect the building to the site in a different way. And so this providing a new entrance off of this side and then expanding the building to the south. And that gave us the opportunity to create a courtyard between these two spaces. A quick view of the plan. The first floor classroom, this is partially underground. This side faces the student main path, creating a new entrance off this side, which allows the students to have easier access into the building. And then a new addition here to the left, which is the main mechanical that we're replacing and sharing with the whole building. On the second floor, which is the quad side of the building, or the quad level of the building, if you will. These are mostly classrooms and the student commons space that we've added, and that faces this courtyard, really great courtyard between the new building and the original two-story library. The third floor was office space, and renovated that to office space and gave every faculty member an exterior window, which was really important for their their individual needs, but we also provided some spaces within this level for students and faculty in the purple area here to gather and meet out in the open areas. On the 4th floor, this will be classics and philosophies, departmental offices, as well as several other spaces that go along with that program. And then there's a small mezzanine classroom on the 5th level, just above on the tower side on the north end of the building. So just a few views of the exterior of the building, looking at the southern edge, sort of southwestern corner of the building is where the addition is located. Continuing some of that collegiate Gothic language in the use of masonry and cast stone and shapes that model the existing building. And accessing the building from the southern end, which is the student pathway, which is the main student path north-south coming up from the commons that crosses the lake. The building has a vertical element that is visible down this path, and we wanted to create something that would mark the location of the building as you view it coming from the southernmost end. And in the courtyard, or the future courtyard on the eastern side of the Great Hall, which is here to the left, there were these existing cherry trees that when we needed to make room for our mechanical courtyard or mechanical space. And so we placed a large tree planter in the middle of that courtyard to allow us to replace that and to provide some soft natural landscape within that brick and stone enclosed area. So inside the addition, as you move from the existing building into the new student commons, there's spaces with a lot of transparency and openness that allow, using the same sort of stone and darker toned woods that would match up with the original building, providing spaces for students to gather both with faculty or meetings or just to hang out. It's a sort of a place for humanity students and for University of Richmond students to gather and to be a part of study groups or what have you. And this also faces out onto the courtyard. We even found some locations within the existing building, like this great bay window, which was part of an office originally. We converted it into and opened it out into the corridor so that students had a space to gather informally for studying and other activities. And the original library is on the left side here, which was converted into faculty offices for the English department back in 1955. And this area will pretty much stay as it is. It's a great space. It has a lot of great natural light, and each of these offices gets refinished, but also the main thing is the thing that Rob was talking about that you can't see is the mechanical systems are really going to make a difference to overall aspects of the building, and they're all energy efficient.
And I'll jump in here just to talk to this slide. And I think this relates a lot to what Rob was speaking to earlier, and actually even a little bit of Danielle's earlier question about how do we accommodate sustainability and preservation and sustainability, and how do we make these more visible? So it's good to see there's some initiative in EarthCraft and even more progress in LEED lately in terms of making these accommodations to make historic buildings very valued. So big improvements that for Ryland, we wanted to come up with, well, what is the REIS value for Ryland? And there's some tools out there, and I'll get to that, what we use, what our carbon estimation toolkit looks like. But basically you're basically comparing what the area of Ryland is and that mass, and what would it take to build something that would be the same kind of use today. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. This type of historic architecture and ways things were built then. It's not necessarily how you would build that today, but it is giving a sense of what you're avoiding, all of that carbon that you're avoiding building and demoing and moving and constructing by keeping that existing building in place. So that's 1,300 metric tons of carbon. That probably doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. So it's back to that tool I showed earlier of, well, how do we start to put this in context? What is 1,300 acres or 1,300 metric tons of carbon? It's 1,700 acres of US forests that sequester carbon for a year, which is about 4.8 times the size of the campus at University of Richmond. So I think it kind of gets back to, well, how can we find more ways that this is more commonly entered in the way that we think about valuing our buildings and making decisions about change? How can this be something that's part of policy? How do we accommodate historic preservation in some of the frameworks for sustainability, like LEED or these other certifications? But also, how do we accommodate this idea of reuse in some of the carbon setting goals? So this is kind of our go-to list of kind of in order of priority of, if we're really going to make impacts to carbon reduction in our buildings, reuse is first and foremost the biggest thing you could do. That impact of all that material created, I think Danielle made a stat or earlier that was, it takes anywhere from 10 to 80 years to recover that. So avoiding that initial investment and making our buildings last is one of the best things to do. Then operations is really important, and making sure that you're using less energy and selecting low carbon materials. So this is our toolkit, and we're happy to share any of the links to these and it kind of goes in that order of depth too. I use some tools there from Build Carbon Neutral and this basically Excel calculator that I use all the time that has some benchmark data about, okay, well, what is a comparison value of rebuilding with new construction? These are databases that are fairly new. The tools and data out there is definitely growing in ways that this is giving us a lot more ability to visualize and understand and control the carbon that's going into our new construction or renovations. And so I think all of those are very promising signs. And I think it just needs to find ways that we can make that relatable as these decisions are being made and feel like it's a valuable part of making an impact on the total carbon. So I think hopefully we have some time for questions. I think I saw some great ones popping into the Q&A. And so just—
Yeah, so on the questions, we can see the questions, and Rob, I know you answered one of them, but no one else could see the question that you were responding to. So I'm gonna read the question that came in and then give you a second, Rob, to speak to that, even though people may have seen what you wrote back. So Rob, can you speak to the difficulty or perceived difficulty of maintaining historic buildings? Institutions that are poorer or perceive themselves as poorer often assume that U of R can do this preservation because they have loads of money. However, I have heard that you have a boiler 10 years older than any of the Richmond Public School boilers. How do you manage your maintenance? And Rob, I'll let you kind of just, I think.
Thanks. And sorry for that. I thought I guess that was kind of weird to see an answer. So thanks for letting me know, Danielle. I think this is a great question, Richard, and I don't turn any screws or hammer any nails. So I can't speak to the difficulty with experience, but I do participate in a lot of the planning, and I get to be occasionally a fly on the wall with the budgetary decision. So we have a facilities condition assessment that for all of the buildings on campus and all of our mechanical systems, we know how old they are and when they are to be replaced. We also evaluate them to see how they're functioning. So even if their life cycle is up, we don't necessarily replace them, or we replace them sooner. So that's how we manage the maintenance part. The perception that U of R is a well-off school, I think, comes from our endowment, and it is a beautiful place. That does not translate to maintenance dollars. And really the way that funding is used, it's an incredibly well-managed school in terms of the economics. The endowment is growing because it's not a great deal of spending that goes on from that. And so I think it's an important thing to note that we are in a very fortunate position as an institution of higher education where a ton of students want to go. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's a lot of money that is spent any more so than a lot of other institutes. So we always looking for energy savings. Our energy use index is the amount of energy used per square foot has actually gone down 25%, not because of sustainability. I love it. It's great because that's correlated with our carbon emissions, but because it's saved money. So we've been doing energy efficiency for a very, very long time. And likewise, it's just baked in. And so the answer that I provided, our boiler team is a bunch of very scrappy people who are incredibly talented and spend too much time underground in steam tunnels. They're really amazing and they are experts in what they do. And we do have some very old systems on campus, no doubt. Some of them I would love to replace because those systems aren't as efficient as they need to be. But that's, again, if it's not on the facilities condition assessment ready to be replaced, it's not going to be. And so that's really tightly managed. So these folks, there's 5 guys, they said, why are we paying somebody to get rid of this thing? And it was a huge multi-ton boiler that was elevated on a platform that they, over a course of quite a few weeks, deconstructed and demoed. And I think there's something enjoyable about demolition that they got into, but this was definitely a skilled labor job. And they saved us, I don't know the exact figure, but a great deal of money that would have been contracted out to other experts. So I think things like that, we're very fortunate to have a crew that is able to do things in-house that maybe some other folks can't. But I think the commitment to energy efficiency, and there are things like energy service corporations that we mimic them. They come in and are able to collect savings and they take a portion of those savings. I think there's a lot of opportunities for organizations to work with. They're called ESCOs. Our folks believe that they can do that themselves, so we don't necessarily farm that out. But if that expertise doesn't exist in-house, those things are also available.
Thank you.
Rob, you also mentioned life cycle, which is, I think, such a key word that we haven't really used that much tonight in a way that I think is really important when we talk about preservation and just the importance of making things last. And so we're always looking at the total energy or total cost, but really if we can avoid that first cost and that first carbon impact and make our buildings and our systems last as long as possible, that's one of the most sustainable strategies.
I think that's a great point. Another resource I didn't mention is our faculty. We have business school faculty who are able to do some life cycle analysis for us. This isn't building related, but we looked at transitioning to electric landscape equipment, battery powered instead of gas powered because of the gas emissions. And a class analyzed the life cycle cost and then took the carbon cost and then presented that to our facilities folks who are reviewing it. And so we can do the same thing with buildings.
All right, let's see. One other question is, will the rehab qualify for state historic tax credits?
It would qualify because it's on the national and state register. But in the beginning of our discussions with the university, we looked at it and had several meetings to go through the process and talk about the requirements and whatnot. But at the end of the day, the university determined they would not pursue that direction. So we are not pursuing historic tax credits on the project now.
Did you replace all windows or save and restore the windows in Ryland Hall?
Well, there was another question on here about improving the exterior envelope, and in a building is this age with a foot thick, solid masonry walls. One of the biggest energy places to conserve energy is through the window openings, because a lot of the faculty were complaining about, the windows wouldn't close and seal properly and those types of things. So we went through several iterations of ideas. And at this stage, we're replacing most of the rectilinear windows in the building. The large Gothic windows on the end of the Gray Hall are going to be retrofitted, renovated. There's some broken glass in that, and it'll all be put back as it is. But by and large, the rectilinear shaped windows will be replaced with new windows that are energy efficient, insulated glass. And we are going to place some real lead strips on those windows so that it has that same sort of architectural character that the original windows did.
So I'm going to kind of combine two questions because I think they're kind of like getting at the same thing. But one is, do you ever have a situation where demolishing is better than reusing a building, and what factors do you consider? And the other question is, isn't the amount of energy preserved in conserving a building dependent on its extent of degradation? For example, the Michigan Central Station is in a fairly severe state of neglect, and it must require far more resources than a building which only needs window and HVAC upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think in part, it depends on what is your priority and what metric are you trying to evaluate. So if it was purely based on total carbon, so between the operational and the embodied carbon, there are situations where it would make more sense to demo and replace if that was your only solution to get you to a much more high performing building. And that the amount of invested materials into that building would be really high anyway, and you wouldn't be able to get to the performance criteria. So those situations do exist, except that it's hard to operate in that vacuum where the carbon is the only reason to assess it. And I think in most situations where you're wanting to preserve parts or all of a historic building or an existing building, even if it's in disrepair, is that there's some value to it, or there's economic, and whether that's either community value or heritage value or just cost value. There's a lot of situations we do on projects where the reuse of that building is the most cost-effective thing to do too. So I think it does depend, and certainly if you have to do a lot of more steel and concrete are one of the most intensive carbon materials out there. So the more you're putting that into your project, the more carbon intensive it will be. But there's certainly a lot of reasons to value reuse either way.
I would just add on to that and say structural is really probably the biggest, determining factor. If the structure is sound, it should be evaluated further. If there are problems with the structure and, foundation issues and those kind of things, they will eventually, it will likely cost more than it would be to replace. So that's one of the bigger factors, I think, like you said.
So I'm gonna do one more question and then call it a night since we're over on time. So this last one is, have you found contractors to be willing to participate and partner in LEED and other certifications, as well as renovation and preservation? I'm an architect and have a deep belief in saving our historic building stock. I believe the greenest building is the one you don't tear down. Yet I find most contractors would much rather build new. It always seems to be a struggle.
I would say that when I first started with the LEED process back, 20 years ago, it was very, hard to find contractors that would participate in it. But I think in most projects that we're working on that have some sort of sustainability portion, contractors have staffs that are very familiar with the process and, are willing to work with it, if it's a requirement of the project. So I see it more as a positive, with the contracting community than it ever has been.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about what is familiar and how much risk is involved, and how do we feel comfortable with managing those risks. So I think that is why it is helpful to have worked with design professionals or contractors who have experience with those types of buildings, because they do have unknowns that can present extra costs. But certainly at this stage, at least, LEED and other certifications are definitely a lot more common. So I think they're more on board there. And so it's just trying to make the costs not go too high for the degree of feeling like there's unknowns that they have to accommodate for.
All right, well, we will check us out on Instagram at Historic RVA, and we can answer some of the other questions on there. This was awesome. Thank you so much to all our panelists and everyone who attended, and feel free to reach out to us with any other questions.
Can I plug one thing real quick, Danielle?
Yeah, sorry, absolutely.
So I have no affiliation to Viridient, but they recently partnered with Richmond Region Energy Alliance. So if folks on the residential live in the Richmond region and are residentially interested, the best thing to do is a building home audit. It will pay for itself. They will insulate and replace bulbs for free, and there's a discount with the state. But questions about the windows made me think of this. I think windows are really easy to look at, and we can feel the wind coming through, but rarely, and that's not going to be your best energy savings. And so if you're thinking about, you might be able to shore up some insulation or just replace some other systems and not even worry about your historic windows and keep them as beautiful as they are and still get the savings. So I think that's a great option for people who want to learn more about improvements they can make. And often they're not that flashy, but they are effective.
Right.
So thank you for letting me say that.
All right. Well, thank you, and everyone have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Mel.